Yes.
Good, that's a relief. Okay. Our subject today is one of the saddest passages in the Bible, but let's get into it a bit slowly. Prophets were supposed, you would think, to support the sanctuary, to support God's temple. But God said to Ezekiel, "Son of man, set your face against Jerusalem and preach against the sanctuary." How sad it is that God should be telling his prophet to preach against his sanctuary. But of course, if the sanctuary is under the control of evil men, it's no longer the house of God. And those who speak for God must preach against it and condemn it. And that applies not just to the ancient Israel, but to the modern church. Martin Luther did the same thing. He set his face against the Christian church and preached against it. The result was the Protestant Reformation. In this painting, classical painting, we see Jesus. And he found it necessary to preach against the temple, to cleanse the temple, driving the money changers out of the church, out of the temple. And if God's house is given over wholly to money making, wholly to power politics, wholly to ego trips, well, it's no longer the house of God. And prophets are called to preach against it. Prophesy against the land of Israel, say to her, "This is what the Lord says, I am against you. I will draw my sword from its sheath and cut off from you both the righteous and the wicked." That's a bit shocking, isn't it? That God's judgments will fall on both the righteous and the wicked. And I believe that is why we have been counseled as God's people to leave the cities, these nests of iniquity, because God doesn't want us caught up in the iniquity of the cities. He doesn't want us caught up in all the violence, the drug taking, the pornography, and all the rest of it that goes on in the cities, and of course the judgments that will fall upon the cities when that time comes. Get out of the cities, that is God's advice. And then God told Ezekiel, "Groan, son of man, groan before them with a broken heart and bitter grief. When they ask you, why are you groaning, you shall say, because of the news that is coming." You can just imagine Ezekiel, this prophet who wasn't allowed to talk except when God gave him something to say, wandering through the camp. And if anybody said, "Morning, Ezekiel." What's wrong, Ezekiel? Why are you groaning? Now Ezekiel has his cue. Now he can speak because of the news that is coming. Every heart will melt with fear. Every hand go limp. Every spirit will become faint. Every leg will be wet with urine. Oh boy, nothing like being graphic, is there? It's coming. It will surely take place, declares the sovereign Lord. And then in a later vision, God said to Ezekiel, "Son of man, mark out 2 roads for the sword of the king of Babylon to take, both starting from the same country. Make a signpost where the road branches off to the city." Now, I don't know what signposts they had in those days. They certainly weren't cast iron ones or aluminium ones like we have today. But God said, mark out 2 roads. One road for the sword to come against Rabbah of the Ammonites. That was the capital city of the Ammonites, where Uriah the Smith was killed fighting against it. And another against Judah and fortified Jerusalem. You see, this coming conflict wasn't just to do with Judah. It wasn't just to do with the Israelites and the city of Jerusalem. It was a whole conspiracy involving just about every nation in the Middle East. We're told about it in the book of Jeremiah, where God got Jeremiah to be a messenger to all these ambassadors who had come to Jerusalem to plot this rebellion. And God told Jeremiah, "Make yourself a yoke, put it on your neck, and then send word to the kings of Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, Sidon, to the envoys who have come to Jerusalem to Zedekiah. Give them a message for their masters and say, this is what Yahweh Almighty, the God of Israel, says. I made the earth and his people, and I give it to anyone I please. Now I will give all your countries into the hands of my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And if any nation or kingdom will not serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, or bow its neck under his yoke, I will punish that nation with the sword, famine, and plague, declares the Lord, until I destroy it by his hand. And of course, the ambassadors, I don't know whether they did take the message back, but that's all Jeremiah could do. And it certainly had no effect, because the nations did rebel, did make this conspiracy, and Nebuchadnezzar began to make preparations to deal with it. And I'm sure that the armchair strategists in Jerusalem were sitting around discussing, well, what will Nebuchadnezzar do? Well, if I were him, I would. And they would hope that if he would attack the other nations first, by the time he gets to Jerusalem, he'll be so weakened that he cannot win. Some of us may be able to remember what it was like during the Second World War, when the newspapers would publish maps showing where the fronts were and how far what was his name? Monty or Eisenhower, how they were getting on. You know, the strategists would stand there with their newspaper in one hand and say, well, I think that next he's going to go there, he's going to make a bold strike again. Oh, they'd be so confident. And it was exactly the same here, with the people around Ezekiel saying, oh, well, you know, what he's going to do is, it makes sense for him to, and Ezekiel erects his signpost in the middle of the camp with two arms, one pointing to Ramoth Ammon and the other pointing to Jerusalem. And Ezekiel describes how Nebuchadnezzar would come to this parting of the ways. For the king of Babylon will stop at the fork in the road, at the junction of the two roads, to seek an omen. He will cast lots with arrows. He will consult his idols. He will examine the liver. The soothsayers, not Nebuchadnezzar himself, but the soothsayers and diviners who are paid to do this, they will examine the liver. And the funny thing is that we have found a model liver in Babylon. And this clay model of a liver, as you can see, it's divided up into squares. There are little words, numbers, cuneiform signs in each square, directing you to a particular tablet in the great library of Babylon. And if there was a mark in one particular place on the liver, well, then you went and looked it up, what it meant in that source book, that encyclopedia. And this is what would happen. Of course, they didn't have the library with them, but these were experienced diviners. These are the state diviners. These guys knew what they were doing. Into his right hand will come the lot for Jerusalem, where he is to set up battering rams, to give the command to slaughter, to sound the battle cry, to set battering rams against the gates, to build a ramp, to erect siege works. Oh dear. So he reaches with his right hand into the pot, and where there are two names. One is Ramoth Ammon and one is Jerusalem. And he pulls out, and in his right hand, unexpectedly, is the lot for Jerusalem. It will seem like a false omen to those who sworn allegiance to him, but he'll remind them of their guilt and take them captive. Zedekiah, maybe he had a spy in the camp. And when the report came back that this was the omen, you must have thought, oh dear, that can't be right, it can't be true. Because he had a guilty conscience, because he'd sworn loyalty in the name of God and then broken his oath. But even though Ramoth Ammon would be spared, Jerusalem would be first, Ezekiel was given a prophecy against the Ammonites. They'd doubtless crow with delight that Jerusalem was going to catch it first. But this is what the sovereign Lord says about the Ammonites and their insults: a sword drawn for the slaughter, polished to consume, and a flash like lightning. God has his eye on the Ammonites. They're not going to get away scot-free. They won't escape permanently. But God's primary controversy is with his own people who have been unfaithful to him. Now, recent excavations in Jerusalem have discovered the truth of the Bible story. These are seal impressions. You took your seal and you stamped it into the clay, and this was the impression. And these are the names of two of the princes who tried to kill Jeremiah: Jehukal, son of Shelemiah, and Gedaliah ben Pashkur. So, yeah, it's interesting that those have been found. But as well as these opponents of God's prophets, also have been found little idols, little teraphim, idols worshipped in Jerusalem around about this time. And take those two things together, the idols, the evidence of apostasy and idolatry, and the seals of Jeremiah's enemies, the men who tried to kill him, and you have a tale of national apostasy from God, a national rebellion against God. And it wasn't just the leaders, it was everyone. Son of man, God says, will you judge Jerusalem? Will you judge the city of bloodshed? Then confront her with all her detestable practices. And that word detestable is an interesting word, as we'll see in a moment. But we can see Ezekiel's audience, the people listening to him, nodding their heads in grim agreement, because they know as well as he does the things that are wrong with Jerusalem. It's just they didn't see them as so serious. The first thing was that the rich people, the princes, they oppressed the poor and the weak. God's Sabbath was despised. It was desecrated, and God's authority was rejected. Slander and murder, they're mentioned together in the same verse, which is a curious combination until you realize that slander murders a man's reputation. Murder merely kills his body. Immorality and incest of every kind, including ritual or religious immorality. God detests these things. Usury, where the rich people loaned money at extortionate rates of interest. And, you know, they really are extortionate. 50% per day is the sort of interest that the money lenders will charge in India. You have no hope of paying it back. No, of course, that's what they want, because then they have you as a debt slave, robbing the people who most need help. And evildoers did not fear punishment because they knew they could always bribe the judges. They could bribe their way out of trouble. There was corruption on every hand. And God said, because of these things, you are going to be put in the furnace. But you're not the gold that's going to be refined and come out pure and gleaming. You are the slag, the scum that rises to the surface and is scooped off and thrown away when the precious metal is smelted. The people of Israel have become dross to me. All of them are the copper, tin, iron, and lead left inside a furnace. They're but the dross of silver. Once upon a time, God regarded his people as precious. Now he dismisses them as just dross. Because you have all become dross, I will gather you into Jerusalem. As silver, copper, iron, lead, and tin are gathered into a furnace to be melted with a fiery blast, so I will gather you in my anger and my wrath and will put you inside the city and melt you. Jerusalem will be the crucible in which the metal is melted. A little bit of precious metal is melted, and the vast amount of dross and slag is swept away and discarded. And then again, Ezekiel lists the sins of Israel. The princes of Israel, the people who should be leaders of the nation, are united in their willingness to kill the innocent in order to make a bit of money. What's most important, the life of a poor man or an extra couple of quid in the bank? Her priests profane God's holy things. They profane God's law. They condone Sabbath breaking instead of rebuking it. Her officials are willing to kill in order to make unjust gain. You know, they're like mafia gangsters. If anybody stands in the way of their profit making, they'll just eliminate them, wipe them out. Her prophets whitewash these deeds. The prophets who should be standing up for right, who should be speaking God's words, are making excuses for the evil that is being committed, and doing it by means of false visions. You know, recently I've been reading Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and I've been impressed how again and again God says, I am against you false prophets. You claim to be speaking in my name, but I have not spoken. And therefore your punishment is going to be greater than anyone else's. But then the real tragedy is that it isn't just the leaders, the princes, the officials, the priests. It's the people of the land, the ordinary, common people who oppress and ill-treat each other and oppress and ill-treat strangers in the land, foreigners. The whole nation is united in doing wrong. God said, I looked for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land, so that I wouldn't have to destroy it. You know, Abraham pleaded for Sodom and said, Lord, if there are 50 righteous, well, look, if there are only 40, if there's only 30, finally he got down to 10. Lord, if there are only 10. And God said, well, if I can find 10, I won't destroy it. But God said, in Jerusalem, I found no one. The entire nation was given over to wrongdoing. And then in chapter 23, now what's happened there? Ezekiel returns to the theme of the adulterous wife. And he tells the story of Israel and Judah in terms of two sisters. And the interesting thing is the name that is given to these two sisters. One is called Aholah, which means her tent or her tabernacle. Is probably a reference to the fact that Israel set up its own sanctuary in Bethel and Dan in rivalry to Jerusalem. But Aholibah, my tabernacle is in her. The younger sister's name refers to the fact that the temple of God was situated in Jerusalem. But then God compares his people to the archetypical city of evil, Sodom, and he calls Sodom their sister. This was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. How homosexuals love this verse. Because they say, you see, it wasn't sodomy that got Sodom into trouble. It was because they were arrogant, because they didn't help the poor and needy. They were unkind. But so long as we're kind, we can do what we like. They need to read the next verse, because God says they were haughty and did detestable things. And as I say, that word is an interesting word. It seems to be particularly related to sexual sins. And in God's law, in Leviticus, God says, do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is, and he uses this word, detestable. So yes, Ezekiel does condemn homosexuality. Yes, the people of Sodom were unkind and unhospitable and all the rest of it. And they were also homosexuals. In the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, record this date. I don't know how Ezekiel recorded it. Perhaps he scratched it into a bit of pottery. This very date, because the king of Babylon laid siege to Jerusalem this very day, was a message that Ezekiel had been dreading. Perhaps other people saw this bit of pottery lying around. What's that, Ezekiel? Why have you made a note of this that day? Oh, the day before yesterday, because that's the day the siege began. What siege? The siege of Jerusalem. How do you know? Well, the people were to find out, because rumor travels fast in the Middle East and in the East in general. And before very long, Ezekiel's prediction was confirmed. And that must have been a shock to the people in the camp who'd been so busy neglecting and disregarding what his messages. But then God had Ezekiel do something very odd. Something strange. There would be an example, a symbol of what he was going to do to Jerusalem. Put on the cooking pot. Ezekiel had to get his wife's prized bronze pot. I don't know whether she'd managed to hang on to it and bring it all the way from Jerusalem, or whether it was something that she'd bartered for with a little bit of money or maybe clothing that they had and bought it in Babylon, but she had this pot. And God told Ezekiel to put it on and pour water into it, put it on the fire, put it on the stove, put into it the pieces of meat, all the choice pieces. Pile wood beneath it for the bones, bring it to the boil and cook the bones in it. I imagine Mrs. Ezekiel had looked after that pot. Every day she'd scrubbed it with a handful of sand so that it gleamed. Do any of you have copper-bottom saucepans? Yeah, well, she was proud of her pot. But Ezekiel put it on the fire. And then instead of stirring it, he simply piled on more and more wood, bringing the pot to the boil, and then the liquid began to boil away. Woe to the city of bloodshed, to the pot now encrusted, whose deposit will not go away. Take the meat out piece by piece, in whatever order it comes. And as the contents of the pot begin to smoke as they burn, Ezekiel reaches in with a ladle and picks each one out and tosses it aside to lie smoking on the ground. Woe to the city of bloodshed, I too will pile the wood high. So heap on the wood, kindle the fire, cook the meat well, mixing in the spices, let the bones be charred, even the very bones. The entire camp was filled with the scent of burning food, and people came from all over. What's burning? What's burning? Ezekiel, don't you realize that's burning? They're urging him to do something. Take the pot off. pour some more water in, perhaps even appealing to his wife to step in and do something. And she, poor woman, just shrugs her shoulders and be like, when he's in one of these moods, I can't do anything with him. And so the people stand around and watch, standing away from the smoke, I imagine. Then set the empty pot on the coals till it becomes hot, and its copper glows so that its impurities may be melted and this deposit burned away. But alas, it has frustrated all efforts. Its heavy deposit has not been removed, not even by fire. I don't know whether any of you have a so-called self-cleaning oven. It's got a special coating on the walls, and every so often you're supposed to set the oven to maximum and keep it at that for, I don't know, 20 minutes, half an hour maybe, and that will clean away the deposits. In Ezekiel's case, the deposits were too thick. They'd already been carbonized. Making the pot hotter didn't clear them away. And then finally, the pot cracks and is ruined. And then at last, Ezekiel lets the fire go out and stalks into his hut, leaving the broken pot sitting there as a silent warning to everyone who went by. God said, because I tried to cleanse you, but you would not be cleansed from your impurity, you will not be clean again until my wrath against you has subsided. I, the Lord, have spoken. The time has come for me to act. I will not hold back. I will not have pity, nor will I relent. You will be judged according to your conduct and your actions, declares the sovereign Lord. Now, you will recall that this was happening not in Ezekiel's original house. You remember back in chapter 12, Ezekiel was told to pack up his belongings and leave the house through a hole in the wall with his eyes blindfolded, carrying what few goods he could manage on his back. At that time, I paid tribute to Ezekiel's wife, and I want to do so again. Remember, she had gone into exile because she was married to Ezekiel. If she'd been married to a street sweeper or a farmer, she'd still be in Palestine. And then, when they got to Babylon, poor old Ezekiel seemed to go mad, and she had to put up with him. She had to look after him. She had to be a loyal wife to him, despite his strange behavior. Who looked after him when he was lying motionless outside his hut? It was his wife. And now, the poor woman had been made homeless at her husband's insistence. I wonder what sort of a hut they were able to move into with the few things they were able to carry. Maybe it was just a rough shelter. A bit of grass, a few palm leaves, nothing much. But she settled down. She tried to make the best she could. And what was worse was that by this time, all the best places in the camp had been taken. The only places left were the places that no one else wanted. Insalubrious, dirty, near the rubbish dump, near the place where the butchers dumped their offal, and maybe it was down by the water's edge where the mosquitoes were thickest, or out in the desert where she had much further to walk to get water. And yet the woman stayed with Ezekiel, a loyal wife to him. She was a true servant of God, just as much as her husband. And now, perhaps because of the place where they were living, or perhaps with some action by God, I think more likely it was because of the place where they were living, she fell sick. Maybe it was malaria, shaking with the fever. And the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, with one blow I am about to take away from you the delight of your eyes. Yet do not lament, or weep, or shed any tears. This was the last appeal that would be made to Israel before the end. Groan quietly. Do not mourn for the dead. Don't wear black clothes. Keep your turban fastened and your sandals on your feet. Do not cover your mustache and beard. Do not eat the customary food of mourners, all the normal things that people do to sort of provide comfort in such a situation. Ezekiel was forbidden to do. And then comes the bleakest verse in the Bible. So I spoke to the people in the morning, and in the evening, my wife died. I wonder how he spent that intervening day. Did he sit by her bed, fanning her face, holding her hand, whispering to tell her that he loved her? I hope so. I spoke to the people in the morning. In the evening, my wife died. And the next morning, I did as I'd been commanded. And the people asked me, won't you tell us what these things have to do with us? Why are you acting like this? Why are you behaving so antisocially? Why aren't you wearing black? Why aren't you going around looking sad? Say to the people of Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am about to desecrate my sanctuary, the stronghold in which you take pride. The sons and daughters you left behind will fall by the sword. Ezekiel dashes the hopes of the people that the revolt will be successful, that they can soon go home. No, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The people in it will die. And you will do as I have done. You will not dare to cover your mustache or beard or eat the customary food of mourners. You'll keep your hats on your heads and your sandals on your feet. You will not dare to mourn or weep. Ezekiel will be assigned you. You will do just as he has done. And when this happens, you will know that I am the sovereign Lord. And in case you think that's strange, remember how it was with all those prisoners of war in the Japanese labor camps. When they saw Allied planes flying overhead, they didn't dare cheer or exult or show signs of joy. When the city near their camp was bombed, they didn't dare show any signs of joy. When a smuggled radio revealed to them news of Allied successes, again, they had to keep quiet. They had to behave just as normal. They didn't dare. And in the same way, these people in the camp, when they hear that the Babylonians have been successful, when the guards are going around with smirks on their faces, grinning, the people dared not show the least sign of discontent or grief or mourning. They had to do exactly as Ezekiel had done. You, son of man, on the day I take away their stronghold, a fugitive will come to tell you the news. At that time, your mouth will be opened. You will speak with him and no longer be silent. Ezekiel's time of being an acted out message was coming to an end, because when it was so clearly demonstrated that Ezekiel was a true prophet, then God would allow him to speak, because the people would listen to him. They would flock to hear his messages instead of needing to be drawn by his odd behavior. But Ezekiel's message would enter a new phase, no longer calling for repentance to avert the catastrophe, because the catastrophe had already happened, but calling the people and leading them into a great reformation. Ezekiel must have had very mixed feelings. On the one hand, he looked forward to the resumption of normal life, to being able to talk, to being able to chat. But on the other hand, inwardly, he was mourning for his wife. And he was not looking forward to the destruction of his childhood home and the death of his friends and family. Let's bow our heads. And now may the grace of God, the love of Jesus, and the close friendship of the Holy Spirit be with us all till he come. Amen.